the focus, can everyone hear?
Yes.
Okay, good, we got that settled. The focus of this, the information I'm going to share with you deals with journalists in the United States. But of course, this is something that can be applied, worldwide. But the examples that I'm going to share are more examples that come from the United States. I want to say they're not all the examples that exist out there. I took some of the most major, individuals who are known for investigative journalists, but it's not all encompassing. So, investigative journalism is a form of journalism in which journalists focus on looking at one particular issue. And it's an issue that often deals with crime, corporate wrongdoing, political corruption, disenfranchisement of individuals in our society, maybe those with learning disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, those who may not be able to advocate for their rights the way you and me can, because we're more established and educated. So again, the themes that we've often seen in the United States: equal rights, whether it be gender or for ethnic minorities, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, workers' rights, like I said, political corruption, criminal justice, economic justice, and the last one, populist, meaning what is going on, there, issues of that particular day that are important to people, or they deem as being important. So looking at the foundations for this in the United States, we go back to the Constitution, and I'm sure a lot of you have studied American history. The first article or amendment of the Constitution refers to freedom of press and assembly. So, this is a real cornerstone for journalists to do their work, and more importantly, that this freedom of expression should occur without interference from the government. So that means without government intimidation, because the government is there in principle to protect and respect your rights. And we're going to see later on that has not always been the case in the United States, but that is the foundation of it. So sources of investigative journalism, research. So people have to look at different sources of documents. And these could be legal documents going to a court, but it also involves analysis. So for example, there will be one example I'll show later on of misconduct that happened in a hospital. I'm not a medical expert, I'm not a doctor, maybe, I don't know if any of you are, but it requires working with somebody who can conduct a good and thorough analysis on these documents to see is the hospital, in the case of the United States, a government hospital, is it overcharging the government? Or were people staying too long in the hospital or short enough based on their illness? You need someone to analyze those documents, and someone who would have the substantive knowledge to do that as part of your investigative work. Other sources are interviews, so speaking to different people. For example, if there are allegations of abuse in a workplace, speaking to different workers, maybe speaking to different workers who have different jobs. But this is also important because, people often use the press for their own personal agenda. So by speaking to different people, you can know, well, is this person telling the truth? How long, if it's at a workplace, how long have they been on the job? If the heart of the matter is abuses that have been going on for 10 years, if you're speaking to someone who's been employed a few months, how much will they know? So speaking to various people. Now, a term we often use in the United States for individuals who find wrongdoing in the workplace and report it is called a whistleblower, blowing a whistle, so sounding the alarm. And they've often worked with investigative journalists, and sometimes at their own peril, because this isn't something that was welcome. But after after several whistleblowers broke major scandals, laws were put in place to protect them, because they do have a right, as I was speaking about the First Amendment, to express themselves, to share this information without being intimidated. Another important piece of legislation that journalists use is the Freedom of Information Act. And this came out after the Watergate scandal, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And what it means is that meetings and transactions are part of a public record. I should say, be specific, government transactions, government meetings, government discussions, unclassified. You can't have everything, obviously. But these are part of public records. Budgets, how money is being spent. So these are tools that journalists often use to do their investigative journalism. But it's also a check for people like me, I'm employed by the government, to know that whatever I'm doing, that somebody may be looking this up in a couple, in a year or so forth, and it's going to be made public. So now we're going to look at the beginnings of investigative journalism. And what I have here are pictures by a photographer and photojournalist named Jacob Riis. Now Jacob Riis, there's a lot one can take from Jacob Riis and Joseph Pulitzer, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. He was originally born in Denmark to a very poor family, one of 15 children. He was a photojournalist and a print journalist. His birthday, just keep this in mind, is May 3rd, which is World Press Freedom Day. And he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And again, those of you who are more familiar with American history, what was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Huge influx of immigrants, mostly from Europe, coming into the United States, coming into New York, and many residing in New York. And the conditions, there was a lot of crowding. There was what we call tenements, living conditions where people should be living maybe in a dwelling for 3 people, 9 people living, no indoor plumbing, sanitation. Children weren't being schooled. Children were working in just the most atrocious conditions one can imagine. And so, as a result of this book, it really revealed some of the squalor that I was talking about related to immigrant life in New York City. And there was reformation of the sweatshops, of New York City schools, and improvements in the Lower East Side. That's like southern part of Manhattan's an island. The Lower East Side in sewage, sanitation, and plumbing. So this is, not only alerting the public, but making changes for the poor and housing. Okay. Now we'll move on to another very important investigative journalist named Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. Chicago was known as a meatpacking district, center for meatpacking and slaughterhouses and the like. And Upton Sinclair took 1 year and worked in those 2 cabinet departments came out of the result of this book. Now on to another person you may have heard of at some point. And this is Joseph Pulitzer, also an immigrant. He came from Hungary. And he is known for, he was a crusader against big business and corruption. And another term you may have heard of in your history courses are the robber barons. These were these individuals who were living these great lifestyles that you read about in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novels, while you had people on the other end who were living in extreme poverty. And so he crusaded against big business and corruption, but he was also a real leader in journalism, mass circulation, advertising, and including different types of articles in newspapers, so entertainment, multiple forms of news, in other words. Now, he created what's called a Pulitzer Prize, which is awarded every year in approximately 21 disciplines of literature and musical composition. But I think the most famous prize, Pulitzer Prize, among them is, without question, for journalism. Now, he established this in 1917 through Columbia School of Journalism, Columbia University, which is the premier school for journalism in the United States. And this award is still given each year. It's $10,000. It's a cash award given to a newspaper, not the individual, him or herself, who wrote the article or did the investigative work. So now we're gonna go through a few the top investigative journalism stories. One, I'm sure most of you have heard of, even though I'm pretty sure none of you were born during this time, but it's the Watergate Scandal. Now, Watergate, why is it called Watergate? Watergate is actually a hotel, and it's, I would say, probably a 5-minute walk from our, what we call U.S. Department of State, or Foreign Ministry. It just happens to be in that area in Washington, D.C. And this scandal, it also involved our then President, Richard M. Nixon, and 2 journalists from the Washington Post, one of the country's premier newspapers, Bob Woodward in the blue shirt and Carl Bernstein in the white shirt. It was also, this was their story, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, was made into a movie called All the President's Men. Some of you may have seen it at some point. But the scandal essentially involved a break-in of the Democratic Party's national headquarters, which were located in the Watergate Hotel. Richard Nixon was a Republican, so the opposing party. And the Nixon administration also wiretapped and the offices of political opponents and people for whom they were suspicious. Now, these were individuals in his administration, in the United States government, who were involved in this illegal activity. And where do Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward come in, the journalists? They learned about this through a confidential informant. And so they're the ones who had uncovered the whole affair, quite frankly. Now, the cover-up of the Nixon administration, it led to his resignation. There was a series of hearings on whether he should resign. He said he wouldn't resign, but it was pretty much in the cards, and the only option was for him to resign. It was the only resignation to date of a U.S. president. And also there was a lot of, there was criminal activity, and so this scandal resulted in 43 individuals, government officials, in their conviction. And many of these were top individuals in his administration. So now we're just going, these are just pictures of the original newspapers that came out at the time. And I'm just going to go through a few modern-day Pulitzer Prize winners and examples of investigative journalism. And you're going to notice that these examples, they come from major newspapers in the United States. And I'll talk about perhaps why that is towards the end. Miami Herald, they showed, uncovered abuses, and these were very lax oversight and regulations for living facilities, assisted living. What does that mean? In the United States, people of a certain age, like senior citizens, sometimes they opt to live in a dwelling where there are other senior citizens. And it's a regular, like there's apartments and things for them to do. And so it was an assisted living facility for older people and mentally ill. There were abuses that were there. So that led to tougher laws and punishment for those violators. Los Angeles Times, again, another big and major newspaper. They found corruption in a small town in California, but the elected officials were taking money from the Treasury to pay themselves. So that led to arrests and reform. Another case of, we're talking about workers and workers' rights. Las Vegas is known for a lot of construction. There were weak regulations related to worker safety, and there were dangers for workers, and this led to changes in policy to improve their safety conditions. And one more, again, this is another case of dealing with neglect and abuse in homes for mentally